Chapter 2 introduces the second big part of sentences grammatically. First, we had verbs in chapter 1, and those are pretty important. They tell you what's going on. The other thing that we need to know is who's doing that action or who are they doing it to, and that's what chapter 2 is about. At least starting in on that concept, which is the idea of nouns in Latin. And so what you're given here, just before we get into the guided notes, is a common, is what a dictionary entry for a Latin noun is going to look like. So we have the one here. Oh, that's supposed to be a star. There we go. Nauta, nautai, masculine, or word for sailor, right? Where you're given three things, one, two, three, for any noun in Latin. Just like most Latin verbs have four parts, Latin nouns have three parts, and the three things that you're given, technically, are what's called the nominative case, which nominative, if you want to write that out, that's right there. Then we have the genitive case, which is the genitive right there, and then we have the gender. Okay, and we will talk about why nominative and genitive are important here in this video. I'm going to do a separate video on adjectives for this chapter, and that's where gender is important. Gender really isn't important when we're just talking about nouns by themselves. It's really once we get into the idea of having adjectives work with those nouns that it becomes important. But I just wanted to touch on this just so you know when I'm talking about nouns and you see these three things, well, what are they? This is hopefully at least a little helpful, lets you, distinguish what we're talking about. But getting into the notes, you have three reference sentences here. Basically, you're going to have to translate these at the end into Latin. They're not used for anything else. They're from the book. I just figured, hey, we'll just take them out of there. I wasn't feeling creative. But chapter 2 notes. So in chapter 1, we saw that Latin verbs have different endings, okay, to signify meaning. So this is where we had word, ost, mus, tis. Wow, that's really bad. Tis or nt, right? And if we wanted to say we, we saw you, we would use mus. But if we wanted to say they did it, we would use nt, right? So just signifying meaning through different endings. Well, the same thing happens in Latin for nouns, which have different endings. Again, wow, surprise, surprise. To indicate how a noun is being used in a sentence, right? So different endings imply different uses for a noun. This is something that's kind of novel in our concepts. English doesn't really do this. The closest thing we have is probably the idea of who as opposed to whom, which is used in different places, right? We don't have an M here in who, but we do in whom. It's the same word, it's just we use it, we have a different form depending on how it's being used. And these different endings are essentially called cases, or you could say case endings as well. I'm fine either way. If you want to call them the case endings or cases, that's fine. But let's just talk about what these are, okay? There are 6 different cases in Latin, 6 total. So 6 total. Different cases, okay? And the first case that we get is the nominative case, and this is used to tell us what the subject of our sentence is. This is the nomen, or the name of your sentence. And this is the noun that does the action of the sentence. Okay, and we'll get some examples here in a second, but let's just go through these cases. So subject is your nominative. Nominative case is used for your subject. Genitive case is used to show possession. So in English, we'd usually have S apostrophe or apostrophe S, flip those around there, or we would use of the, or of, of the blank, right? Something like that is the way that we're going to say showing possession in Latin, or in English. The dative case, okay, is used to indicate the indirect object. And this is obviously the noun that is indirectly affected. Not very clever there. Indirectly affected by the action of the sentence. So we're looking at the verb. If there's a word that is indirectly affected, not directly affected, but in some kind of roundabout way affected by the action, that's your indirect object. In English, typically, we're going to see either 2 or 4 for the indirect object, just by itself. The accusative case is used to indicate your direct object. Okay, and this is the noun that is directly instead of indirectly affected by the action of the sentence. I don't like the way that looks. Directly affected by the action of the sentence. There's no real special way to sort of signify how these are going to look. We have the ablative case. I don't have anything to fill out here. It's used with special constructions and with prepositions. Okay. These other cases can be used with different different things, like accusative case is going to also be used with prepositions, or the dative case could be too. Okay, but ablative is really just used for those things. It's kind of a catch-all for everything else. Okay, there's a lot of uses for it. And then the vocative case. It's used when you're directly calling out to someone, in a sentence. It comes from the Latin verb to call, which you should know is vocare. We should know that one. That's last chapter. We're not going to use the vocative a lot, and actually we're going to probably stop talking about it here after chapter 3, because there's something weird about the vocative in the second declension that we have to talk about. After that, we're probably going to be done with it. Okay. So let's just very quickly see here. Okay, so if we said nominative, we could say, and let's just use sailor. We could say the sailor sees you. Okay, and that's an example of nominative. It's the subject. It's doing the action. The sailor is doing the seeing. Okay, if we said, this is the sailor's ship. Here, sailor is showing possession, right? So that would be genitive case. Okay, dative case. I could say I sent the cookies to the sailor. Okay, I am doing the sending, and what am I sending? Sending cookies. Who am I sending them to? The sailor, right? So that's a second thing, right? I sent. What did I send? That's the first question. Who did I send it to? The sailor. The second question there, indirectly affected, right? The second thing affected by me sending. So that's the idea of an indirect object, okay? The accusative, if I said, I saw the sailor, okay? What does that say? I am doing the seeing. Who am I seeing? The sailor. That's your accusative. It's directly affected by my seeing. Just like in the dative sentence, I sent the cookies. The cookies is an example of the accusative, or the direct object. Okay? Ablative, I could say something like, I went with the sailor. Right? And here, this is a prepositional phrase, so with the sailor, and sailor would be in the ablative case. Okay? And then vocative, the last one, we could just be like, hey sailor. I don't know why I said it like that, but there you go. And that would be an idea of you're directly calling out to this sailor. And so that's the vocative case. Okay? These are just some brief examples of what each one of these looks like in English before we sort of see how they're used in the Latin. So, back to the notes. Oh no. There we go. All right. Back to the notes. Okay. The first thing that we're going to talk about is what's called the first declension. Okay. And this is one of 5 declensions. Okay. So out of 5 total declensions. in Latin. Okay, and essentially a declension is very similar to the idea of a conjugation, right? So when we looked at a verb conjugation, that was listing out all of its forms for tense, mood, and voice. Nouns have the same thing, okay? And a listing out of a noun's forms is called a declension. Okay, so if I said decline a noun, that's what I'm going to say to do. I don't say conjugate a noun. You decline a noun, conjugate verbs. And the noun will change its ending based on how it is used. Okay. Now there are 5 different declensions. Each noun in Latin belongs to one of those 5. And that's helpful because we have different sets of endings. Okay, so we have a first declension set of endings. And then we're going to have a second, third, fourth, and fifth. So instead of having to memorize all of the endings for every single Latin word, all you have to do is memorize the declension charts and know what declension a noun is, and that's all you need to do, right? You can then add those endings onto that noun, and you don't have to have every single form memorized. Sometimes in English, that's what makes English hard, because everything is so, varied and different and doesn't follow rules. People have to memorize so much more, whereas Latin says, hey, we have 5 declensions, we have 5 sets of endings, every single word uses one of those 5. Seems like a lot easier system, if you ask me, even if people think it's more difficult. So what are our first declension case endings? Okay, so the first one, our nominative form. If our verb is if our noun is the subject of a sentence in its first declension, it will have an A ending. Okay, and then if it's genitive showing possession, it's AE. Dative is AE again. Accusative AM. Ablative is a long A, and then vocative is an A. And really, vocative and nominative are pretty much always the same. There's only one part and one form where that's going to be different for any noun in Latin, and that's why we're going to stop talking about vocative here after next chapter. Now that's singular. Ah. If we want to do plural, here are your endings. So if we wanted to say sailor, now ta, sailors, now tie, genitive again, of the sailors, now tie, or of the sailor, of the sailors, it'd be now tarum. Dative, I sent this to the sailor, or I sent this to the sailors, is an is, now tis. Accusative, now tom, or now tas. Now tis, and then nominative and vocative are almost always the same. Now tie. Okay, so we have these different endings. Okay, and these endings are added just like the personal endings of a verb are added to the verb stem. Remember, that's the infinitive minus the re. These case endings are added to the stem of a noun, which is a different stem than you would have for a verb. Okay, so the stem for a noun is found by removing the AE from the genitive form, which is the second part. Okay, so if we went back to our example of now to now tie, let's do it down here. Your second part, 1, 2, so we're going to be dealing with this. To get your stem, you just get rid of the AE, so your stem is nout, and then you add your endings to that. And now you might be saying, well, couldn't I just get rid of this A here and I get the same exact thing? And that is true. That is very true. But that's not always going to be true for every case and every declension every time. So it's very helpful just to know it. This is the second part. Get your stem from there, add your endings. That's going to be true for every single declension, for every single word. Okay, so your stem would be nout there for sailor. If we come back here, okay, what would be the stem for puella, puellai? Well, take your second part and get rid of your AE, and what are you left with? Be puel. And then you add your endings, okay? Now, what I would like you to try to do is let's just try and decline puella, puellai on your note sheet, see what we can do there. And actually what we'll do is we'll deal with these reference sentences together. Let's actually do those together. So try this out and we'll get going from there.